Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with a slightly different video to my usual watch reviews. Today we're going to have a look at the question if watches are actually an investment. So I'm going to split the video up into brands. So we're going to look at a few different brands, some of the main brands in the Swiss watch industry, and see what they are like in terms of an investment, and then actually looking at individual models within each brand. And then actually looking at some track records and some figures, seeing what the prices were a few years ago versus now. The watch industry has changed a lot in the last few years, maybe 3-4 years I'd say. The watch industry has really boomed. There's been a lot of attention on the industry, and prices because of that have gone pretty crazy. So most of my date backs that I'm going to look at previous prices will only be 2 to 3 years ago, so not very long ago. But you can see a huge change in price just in that time. So let's start with Rolex. Rolex is kind of one of the biggest brands in the world, in the Swiss watch world, and they actually offer quite a few good investment watches for people, and they also have a really good track record. So for example, the steel Submariner, the reference 116610LN, so the standard black ceramic date Submariner, that model back in 2016 was going for around £5,000 for a used piece, and then a new piece kind of £5,500. Now a used piece is well above £7,000, and you're looking at sort of mid to late sevens for a unworn piece. So we've seen an increase in £2,000 minimum over the last couple years, 2 years, which is a massive increase. That's almost 50% increase on the watch back in 2016. While we're on the Submariner, let's look at the Sea Dweller as well, because that's kind of a similar watch, kind of the bigger brother or the more professional brother of the Submariner. And that has done also really well. Not quite as well as the Submariner because it's more of a specialist watch. Not as many people buy that watch. So it's not quite the same market, but it is extremely popular. So for example, the D Blue was selling for around £8,000 to £9,000 for a brand new one back in 2016, and now they're selling for around almost £14,000 for an unworn one. They are quite hard to get hold of, the D Blue, so that does ramp up the price. And I think probably because Rolex doesn't make as many of those as they do the standard Submariner, I think that's why they're slightly harder to get. The Daytona is probably the most iconic investment watch from Rolex. So the Daytona back in probably I'd say 3 years ago, 2015, was going for around £6,000 to £7,000, and then probably around £7,500 for an unworn piece. And now you're looking at probably for a used one in the region of £13,000 for a used piece, and up actually if you went for a 2016 version, so the last production year of the old model, the 16520, you're looking at almost £18,000 for an unworn version. So a huge difference in price there. Back then the watch was still relatively hard to get hold of. We found it sometimes difficult for clients to be able to get the steel Submariner, but it wasn't as hard as it is now. It is much harder. They're much more sought after. The new model goes for £15,000 roughly for an unworn piece. So they've probably moved the most out of all the Rolex watches in price. So yeah, they're definitely a good one to put your money in. They have slowed down a little bit in terms of movement now, and the Submariners and the GMTs and those other steel watches from Rolex are catching up. Yeah, they've definitely slowed compared to probably beginning of this year. They were really moving a lot, and last year as well. Other notable watches are watches like the Batman from the GMT collection, the steel blue dial Sky Dweller, and a few other Sky Dwellers, but mostly that steel one. The two-tone one does quite well as well. That sells for list to over list price. But those kind of the GMTs and the Sky Dwellers and the Submariner and the Daytona are the two biggest. There are other watches like the Yachtmaster 2 that does quite well in steel, but those are the kind of main watches to look at, and the Sea Dweller as well. Vintage Rolexes also are very popular, and they do really well. If you buy the right one, you're always going to do well from a vintage Rolex. Some of them go up in value because of patina and fading on the dial and the bezels, and they turn a sort of tropical color, and that adds value to the watch because it makes it a little bit more unique. The newer models, you know, kind of really that it is going to go up. Whereas the older ones, there's a lot of faking going on with patinas and fading and tropical dials. So you do really have to be careful in the vintage market. The older Submariners, vintage Submariners, are going for 30, 40,000 pounds. So they are worth a lot more money than they used to be back when they were originally sold. And also it's the same story with the Daytona, the steel Daytona, like a Paul Newman Daytona, that can go 70, 80,000 pounds and sometimes even more depending on the model you can get. So you can definitely do well out of the vintage Rolexes, but it's harder to judge. It's more difficult to find the correct piece. The trouble also with those vintage pieces is there's a very limited market of people actually looking to buy those watches. It's such a small audience that is willing to spend £40,000 on a steel Submariner. So whereas when you buy a steel Submariner, the new reference one from 2018, you know that there's going to be someone who wants to buy that, or plenty of people that want to buy that in 2 years' time or 1 month's time. Now moving on to Patek. I'm actually going to start with an older reference Patek because most of what I'll talk about is the Nautiluses and the Aquanauts, but the older Pateks have done well as well. So for example, the 5146, which is the annual calendar, kind of the classic annual calendar watch from Patek. Very classic case, is a dress watch, and that is really what Patek has been famous for. The 5146 back in 2008 was going for around 12 to 13,000 pounds, and now you're looking at the high 20s. So that watch has doubled in 10 years. It's a steady investment. All those older Pateks are a great and steady investment because they're going to go up. They're not going to shoot up like a steel Daytona will, but it's going to keep going and going. Now let's move on to their sports watches. That's where we've seen crazy amounts of growth, especially in the last year. So maybe 2017 to 2018, we've seen an insane amount of growth from Patek. Some real attention on the brand, and it's done very well for the aftermarket of Patek, so the used market for Patek. For example, the 5711 in steel is a very famous collector's Patek, or hard to get hold of Patek, and that piece back in 2016 was going for around £22,000 used in mint condition, and then kind of 24, 25, maximum 25 for a sealed version, so inside the double seal, inside the little Patek cardboard box. So 24, 25 for a really brand new, fresh one from the factory. Now you're looking at kind of more near the 30s, 40s region for a used one, and you're looking at mid 40s to high 40s for a sealed inside the box one. So that's doubled in 2 years, which is insane. The rose gold 5711 is a similar story. They were going kind of late 20s, early 30s for a new one, and now you're looking at well over £50,000 for a new one. The 5980 is another iconic sports watch from Patek. 5980 in rose on the leather strap. In 2016, that was going for around 35 grand for a used piece, and then probably late 30s, around late 30s for a new one. And now you're looking at kind of 50s for a new one, and very late 40s for a used piece. So that's definitely come up. And the 5980 full bracelet version, the full rose gold bracelet 5980, that was around in 2016 around 50 to 55 for a new piece, and now it's going for almost 85,000 pounds. The other day I saw someone selling it for around 85 grand, which is crazy. Those have done some of the best out of all the Patek watches, which is absolutely amazing to me because it's such a small market that can afford the full rose gold Nautilus, and to think that they've gone up that much in value is amazing. There are other watches from Patek like the Aquanauts, the steel Aquanauts, and the Travel Times, the rose gold ones. They sell for well over list price as well. They've done really well over the years, the last couple of years, but the 5711 and 5980 for me were the most notable watches. On to the next brand. Audemars Piguet hasn't seen the same growth that Rolex and Patek have. It's on some watches, they are pretty stagnant. They don't really move much in price over the years. Yeah, we are seeing a little bit more growth from the steel Royal Oaks, just the standard date and time Royal Oaks, non-chrono, the 15400 specifically. And those have become much harder to get hold of. They are definitely increasing in price a little bit, but nothing compared to 5711s and offerings from Rolex. So I think it's a shame that AP hasn't caught up yet. I hope they will, because I think they deserve to be up there and have that same growth that the other brands are. But yeah, what do you guys think? Comment in the comment section if you think that AP will come up, or do you think they'll stay down where they are, or kind of hold their prices. And other brands that will have a little bit of movement, but not really as much as those top three, or really the top two, Rolex and Patek, are Tag and Omega, and Breitling and other brands like that, Jaeger. You will see a little bit of movement in price, 100%, but you've got to wait a much longer period of time before you see as much growth as you do from the Rolexes. But it's not to say they don't go up at all, it's just not as much as those other brands. So that's it for brands. Let's kind of look at what makes a good investment watch. So if you look at most of those watches that I mentioned there, in fact, pretty much all of them, apart from the 5146, the annual calendars, and the classic Pateks, which are just a given to go up over the years, they are all sports watches. So if you look at Rolex, we've got our Submariner, Sea Dweller, Daytona, GMT Sky Dweller as our big increases in value. The Cellini from Rolex is a very unpopular watch. We have never really been asked for a Cellini. It's a classic watch, and Rolex really specializes in sports watches. So I don't really know personally how the growth is on Cellinis. I don't think it would be significant, but I'm sure they do grow a little bit. But I've seen, same the Pateks, most of the Pateks that we mentioned there that go up in value are their sports watches, their Nautiluses and their Aquanauts. And from AP, the Royal Oaks will be the ones that move up, not necessarily the Millenaries and other pieces from AP that are a bit more classic. So I kind of had to think why that is, that those more classic watches don't do as well, and why those sports watches just go crazy. I think it's probably to do with pop culture, that we see a lot in the news and celebrities wearing these sports watches. I think in the 90s, when they became quite popular, the sports watches, like the Royal Oak Offshore and the Submariners, become much more popular around that time. They've been popular for years, Royal Oak sports watches, but they became a bit more of a status symbol back then. It was kind of like an achievement and a way to show people of your wealth. Watches has been that all, for a very long time, but for people who didn't necessarily have much knowledge of watches, they saw a lot of people wearing these sports watches, and that's what they went for. And also over the years, style in general has become a lot more casual. If you look back to the 20s and around that time, that people were much smarter. They wore suits and jackets and blazers and proper trousers, whereas nowadays a lot of the fashion is tracksuits and much more casual style. Especially in the 90s, a lot of tracksuits around then. So I think the casual style has meant people don't necessarily want to wear such a smart watch. I think the reason why sports models are much more of a better investment than the dress watches is because that is generally what people are looking to buy nowadays. For example, 90 to 95% of the watches that we get asked for are sports watches. The majority of the Rolex collection is sports watches. The most popular AP sports watches, the most popular Pateks are sports watches. Most of the watches available now are sports watches. So that is why those are the best ones to buy. But that's not just the only thing that is an important factor in buying an investment watch. Metal is also a very important thing to think about. Now, steel will always do the best because that was the entry-level watch. So, for example, the steel Submariner or the steel Daytona is maybe a better example. The steel Daytona the Daytona in general was seen as a watch you buy when you've achieved something, like an achievement success watch. And the way to get into the Daytona was to buy in at the steel level because that was the most affordable level. So what happened as sports watches became more and more popular and more people were buying luxury sports watches, the steel models were selling the most because that's what people could afford. And then when people started really buying up the steel watches, they became much harder to get hold of. And then over the years now, like we see with the Daytona, they now all sell for over list price. To get an unworn piece in the used market is very expensive, and it sells for well over Rolex's retail price. And that's because Rolex doesn't necessarily produce a lot of them, and a lot of people want the steel watches because, like I said, that's the entry level. And now we're seeing this crazy skew where steel watches are becoming almost the same price as rose gold watches. For example, the steel old Daytona, the 2016 one, near 19,000 pounds for one of those now. You can actually get a full rose gold brand new Rolex Daytona for around £23,000–24,000, whereas the retail difference is well over £10,000. It's almost £17,000 difference between those two watches, but the actual aftermarket value difference of those two watches is more like 5, which is mad. We are seeing now that some of the bimetal Daytonas and the bimetal watches are coming up, because what's crazy to me is that people pay more for a steel version rather than the two-tone one. So you can have steel and gold rather than just steel, but people are paying much more for the steel, so that's starting to balance out now, and the bimetal ones are becoming a little bit more expensive. So steel is probably the best metal to buy for an investment. The next is rose gold, and then platinum after that, and white gold, and then finally it's yellow gold last. Yellow gold is generally the least popular metal we find. White gold is very popular for the classic Pateks. But other than that, there's not many real investment watches that are in precious metals. So that concludes my video on investment watches, but my most important rule to buying an investment watch is just buy a watch that you like. It should just be an add-on, or just a cherry on top of the cake that it goes up in value. Watches are designed to be enjoyed anyway, so I believe you should buy it because you love it, not because you want to make some money off it. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think about investment watches. Do you believe in buying watches for an investment, or do you believe in just buying a watch because you love the watch? Let us know, and let us know some other watches that you think are a good investment. Maybe I missed some out. Thanks for watching.